I'll see if I can dig up one of his papers and send it to you.
Okay, we're going live.
I'm sure Stan is familiar with his work.
We are live.
You would think.
Okay, so that's really good, Emmy. We're live 2 minutes in advance of the countdown clock.
Yep, and let me minimize this screen, and I will share my screen and just get this ready to go.
Okay, so we should say for anybody who watches the archival video, they're tuning in right now and hearing this conversation. So the formal program won't begin until the top of the hour, which is still 11 or 12 minutes away. And we'll be starting the countdown at 10 minutes before the hour.
So in the next 10 minutes, we'll be covering everything interesting. But to reward you for watching the archival video.
Now we'll just have to see if the timer actually plays when I press the space bar, because last time that was...
Oh, yeah.
I had a little issue with that. Okay, let's... Yeah. Oh, there it goes. Good.
It's so nice when things work.
Yes, it is. So when we were just...
that you mentioned in the... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, Jeffrey Martin, or maybe this would be a question also for the live stream. Maybe I'll wait it for... I'll keep it for the live when we actually officially begin. A question for you about consciousness studies versus parapsychology. You said something interesting before we went live, and it brought up a question within me, but I think maybe I'll wait till we officially begin.
Well, you know what? There'll probably be 3 or 4 times as many people watching the archival video as who will be joining us live.
Mm-hmm. So I should go ahead and ask my question?
Yeah, I think you should.
Okay, so here's my question.
My joke might turn out to be true.
What's that?
My joke I made a minute ago might turn out to be true. This question could be like better than the whole show, right?
Oh. Well, as I am a practitioner of, we're all practitioners of consciousness and parapsychology, whether we're always aware of it or not, and also I'm a student of it. My question for you, Jeffrey Martin, is that what is the difference between consciousness studies and parapsychology, and which is sort of the umbrella to that? Because I sort of feel like maybe consciousness studies is the umbrella, but how do you frame it within yourself?
I think of it the same way. Yeah, I think that consciousness studies is the umbrella that a lot of other things can go under. And it includes, I think, parapsychology. Who knows, whether the parapsychology community would agree with that or not agree with it. But yeah, that's the way I think. And so if you think about like CIHS, the university, one of the things that I'm doing is trying to think about, what's missing, right? And so if you have this, it's kind of like the last consciousness-based graduate school sort of standing. What is it that it doesn't have program-wise? And one of the programs that it doesn't have, and really that I don't think anybody in America has, is a parapsychology program, right? And so to me, it's one of those things that should be in the fold. And so we're working on it, we're working on it with Jeff and Cal, and hoping it goes live in winter quarter here. We'll see. But there are things like that. I think psychedelics is another one that we don't have. Right now, psychedelics is suffering some setbacks. It's not clear as we make this video what's going to happen with the FDA and the whole Lycos research thing and all of that, the MAPS research, basically. There was a bill that passed the legislature last year in California that would have made it possible for us to actually train therapists with administering these different psychedelic substances. which is something that you also really can't do inside of an academic institution right now. And we could have done it because we're not a Title V school, so we don't have to have a drug-free school, basically. It's one of the requirements for Title V universities. Title V means you take a bunch of money from the federal government and they tell you all kinds of things you can't do. And so we didn't have that restriction. And if the government of California, passes something that says that it can be done in California, we're a California-based entity, so we could do it. But then so the governor last year vetoed that bill, which I think surprised people, and then sent it back to the legislature, and they just assumed, okay, well, the governor has made his changes, and now the legislature is just going to pass it and send it back for a signature. But it never made it out of the budget committee this year. It got killed basically during the budget process in California, where they decide what they are and aren't going to pay for. And so it's had some setbacks like that recently that has me not, sure whether or not that's a good use of resources for us right now. But ultimately, I think, a lot of things like this should all be present in a consciousness-oriented school, including AI. We're working on an AI program with Ben Goertzel, and a Chinese language one with Liz Lee, and also Ben. And, Ben, if you don't know who he is, he's sort of the leader of the artificial general intelligence movement, the thinking machines version of AI versus the narrow version, like the Googles and stuff like that.
He's been a guest
and that to me
on
is another
Your
form of
Thinking
consciousness.
Aloud a couple of times.
Yeah, I would expect. That makes sense. Super nice guy, amazing thinker, right? I love spending time with him. Just such a brilliant mind, and so incredibly insightful.
He was willing
and so
to
I think AI is
explore-
another consciousness, that's coming on the scene soon. And so that should also be under the consciousness umbrella. And so I think of it as broadly including all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Ben Goertzel and I had two conversations. One was on reincarnation and robots, and the other was robots and telepathy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he's
Probably more AI and telepathy than robots and
thinking
telepathy.
about those things. Yeah.
Yeah. He had this thing in Panama a few months ago that he invited, I don't remember how many, maybe 100 of us were there, down to. And I gave a talk, of course, about what I usually talk about, which is fundamental well-being, And so I gave a talk about fundamental well-being and enlightenment. And I made a comment, something to the effect of, being uncertain about whether there would be side effects and stuff like that inside of, more developed AGI.
Mm-hmm.
And, Ben got up in the question section and kind of, gave his side of it. And then we had a fascinating conversation about it afterward. He's a real believer that if you've got super intelligence, superhuman intelligence, you're going to get side effects. And so he's got some fascinating perspectives like that, right? He's an incredibly cool guy, a very cool thinker.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's a follow-up question then to consciousness studies or consciousness parapsychology. Because I actually have a bachelor's in psychology, so then how would you differentiate, or where would you put within that structure of psychology and consciousness studies?
Well, psychology is smack dab center in it, I think, of course. It's literally the science of consciousness in so many ways at this point, at least from an empirical standpoint. So yeah, I'd put it at the middle of it all. Probably right alongside quantum physics, which I think, we're going to discover more and more is psychology.
Mm-hmm.
As they start to really do some of the more interesting observer effect stuff. I don't know. You've had Thomas Brophy on recently, right?
Not recently. We re-released an older video.
Okay.
He came here to Albuquerque in 2020, if I recall correctly, right before the pandemic.
Right on. Well, if you get him back, and I'm sure you will, ask him about his idea for an experiment in sort of the quantum space around consciousness, because I think he's actually got one of the most interesting ideas,
Mm.
and really trying to make that idea a reality. I'm not going to do it justice like he can. He's a serious physicist. But there's a handful of labs in the world that could actually do it. And so I really, really hope that we can get it done. There's not very many ideas like that could have a really groundbreaking result. I think it's important to get as many of those ideas as we can done, to see what the results actually turn out to be.
Well, now you've really piqued my curiosity.
Yeah.
We'll have to have him back. Of course, he's busy being the president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences now. I'm sure it's sort of like you're both new presidents.
Yeah. So I'm sure he's doing great. I'd see him all the time. So I don't think you have to worry too much about that. He seems to be having a great time over at IONS.
Good.
We're going to begin in under 20 seconds.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Now we are officially beginning the live stream program. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove with my co-host, Emmy Vadnais, and today we are blessed to have the new president of the California Institute of Human Science with us, Jeffery Martin, who is also a consciousness researcher, has been a guest on New Thinking Aloud many times in the past, talking about his work on non-symbolic consciousness, talking about his experiences with Reiki healing. And we recently re-released a video with him titled Transitioning to Enlightenment. Welcome, Jeffery.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
It's great to be with you. I think it would be very useful for our viewers to begin with if you would talk a little bit about your history and what brought you to your present position. Well, how did that trajectory work for you?
Absolutely. So I've had a ridiculously diverse background, as I think is true for a lot of people these days. It's not like the good old days of where my dad, went to work for Caterpillar and then retired from Caterpillar, decades later, and then lived in Phoenix and then died, right? And so, people that are just a little bit younger than that, it seems like go through a new career every 10 years or something like that. And so I've had sort of one of those backgrounds, from technology early in my life and broadcasting and lots of entrepreneurship, lots of building companies, investing, all of that type of stuff. But one thing that led me to this point really is that throughout all of that, I was constantly sort of nagged by the larger existential questions, why anything existed in the first place, and whatnot. And by my mid-30s, I really reached a point where I, kind of had it all, but wasn't as happy as I thought I could be. Now, I wasn't miserable or, depressed or anything like that. I mean, I had a really wonderful life, and I would say I was happy. But it was very clear to me that there were people that were a lot happier than I was. And I felt like I'd really worked hard to that point. And sort of the world kind of, and society kind of promised that if they'd done the things that I did, that I would be in the upper ranks of happiness and not the sort of middle ranks of happiness or whatever. And so I thought, well, okay, I feel like I've kind of been lied to by what I should have done to get to this point. So let's go tackle this happy thing for a couple of years and see if we can max out happiness, see if we can max out well-being. And then I'll just get back to building businesses and whatever that I was doing before that, right? And of course, I never got back to that really. And so here we are all of those years later. I wound up going back to school at that point. Back then, I think I had probably had a couple of master's degrees in like management and technology, but nothing that really trained me to do research. And so I went to CIHS, California Institute of Integral Studies, and I went actually to Harvard at the same time. And I could go to CIS online. And so I was going to CIS online, and then I was mostly in Boston, of course. And I really got a very strong grounding in how to do both quantitative and qualitative mixed methods research. You know, I think Harvard's probably one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world, at quantitative stuff. And CIS, I really think at the time, at least, was one of the very best for qualitative stuff and mixed methods stuff. And so that equipped me with the skills to then really go answer my question. People often ask, well, how come you just didn't, put some money towards other scientists to research things? It's because I had put plenty of money towards scientists for things over the time. And I realized from that I wasn't probably going to get good answers from them. It seemed like most people that were good were kind of stuck in the career track of the academy, where it was like, get a grant, make some incremental progress, write a paper up about it to justify getting another grant to make some more incremental progress, to write up, to get another grant, right? And so it's all about how much money have you brought into your university and how many papers have you published, right? And so they were optimized for that. They weren't really optimized for me giving them some money and them giving me good impact in a year or two. And I thought, well, okay, I'll just, I'll learn how to do that. And I'll take a crack at doing that myself. I was young and confident and, had a lot of success with the stuff that I'd done up to that point. So it seemed like this was just another thing that I could knock out. And so I set out to do that. And we started studying the happiest people that I could find. We started trying to look for who are the happiest people. To my surprise, they wound up being people that were often purporting to experience things like enlightenment, non-duality, persistent mystical states. We have hundreds of terms cataloged for that at this point. And initially, I was very skeptical of those people and their claims. I wasn't sure if they were just lying to me or delusional. It sounded like all too good to be true. So the early research subjects really got raked over the coals as, only the education that I had could teach you how to do. But pretty short order, I realized, okay, no, this doesn't seem like they're self-deceptive, and it doesn't seem like they're being actively deceptive. It really seems like this could be a thing. And so we started down the process of very, very serious investigation to the tune of, millions and millions of dollars in resources over the last nearly 20 years now. Really the largest sort of research project of its time into that. Very successful project, sort of the first pan-tradition, cross-cultural phenomenological map of the territory so that we could create some, best guesses for neuroscience type measurement and physiological type measurement out of that. Then the neuroscience stuff, partnering with really good people all around the world for that, really consistent results out of those people that sort of converged. And then we had targets to go on in the brain. Some of those people then had some of the early fMRI scanners that could do neurofeedback. And so we were able to actually validate the regions. You could put some grad students in there and have them match the activity level, for instance, in a part of the brain, right? And they would sound an awful lot like the enlightened guy that was in there, that was being measured before that the target was chosen off of. Went on from that to things like brain zapping. We've supported a lot of and done some of it as well ourselves, the leading sort of brain zapping projects that are out there. That's a slang term, obviously, for this. I'm talking about all sorts of generally low intensity, non-invasive types of things. You name it, we've tried it. We think probably focused transcranial ultrasound is the most effective of all of that. And so we reached a point eventually where we could help people get there. We had to do that so that we could get pre and post data. But up to a certain point, we were only able to work with people who were already there. But of course, there comes a time in any scientific project where you want to be able to measure them before and during and after, right? And see what the specific changes are, and then follow them also over time and see how that unfolds for them over time. And so that led to us developing a protocol that basically was very successful at transitioning people to this rapidly and safely within, a university research environment that's governed by institutional review boards and strong ethics and things like that. And then also looking at how they unfold over time. What are the developmental paths for this? Human development is pretty well studied in its conventional sense. All of our families, all of our societal institutions, including the educational institutions, they're all geared around kind of traditional human development. Well, was this something that was going to continue on with that traditional human development, or was this going to look different than that traditional human development? In fact, it did look quite different than that. And so for the last, I would say since probably about 2017, however many years that's been, we've basically been focused a lot on the developmental side of it. So bottom line is basically over the years, we just sort of built a reputation as the serious scientific project in the space. And CIHS is a university that is based in consciousness. I was helping them out as their dean of research. I've done that before in this sort of space of more consciousness-oriented universities that align in some way with our research. And so at the time, I was helping them out as their dean of research, doing things like running their institutional review board for research and helping students to better understand how to construct better research projects and improve their research projects for their doctoral dissertations and stuff like that. That's basically what a dean of research does. And Thomas Brophy basically decided to go, who was the president at the time, good friend of mine, amazing person. He decided to go over to IONS to become the president of IONS. And, they asked me if I would come in and help out for a while as the president after Thomas left. And I said, sure. I think that surprised them. I think a lot of people were surprised that I went in this direction. But all I can say is sort of intuitively, I just felt like it was the right thing. I didn't even need to think about it while I was on the call with him, with Thomas and one of the senior members of the board, the vice chairman of the board, Tim Laporte. I was just like, sure, it just feels right. And so I jumped over, and I've since come to realize, I'm sort of like, why was that intuition there? Why did I really feel like I should do that? Because I've got a fantastic life, frankly. I'm so unbelievably grateful for my life. And to throw something like running a university into it is a serious, wrench sort of into sort of what my day looked like before that, right? And so I was sort of, was why, what was that intuition about? Well, on one level, I knew that I really consider CIHS maybe the last serious consciousness school standing. There's been a lot of these schools that have been taken over. So you have, and I won't get into specific names or anything like that, but you have schools that have been, really sort of commercializing education. And so, the sort of the for-profit model, even if they're nonprofits, they're still kind of in a for-profit type of model, right? And so they've been buying a lot of different schools and merging with those schools and, building sort of larger and larger businesses, as universities, if you will. And a lot of the schools in this consciousness-oriented space were ripe to be taken over by those folks, and have been purchased, merged in. And so, you went from being in almost every case, small, struggling school, but with a faculty and a staff and everything that was just all in on consciousness and totally dedicated and devoted to consciousness. And now you've kind of been swallowed up, usually because of your location. A lot of these schools are in California. They were in desirable parts of California. So they were a great way to get a foothold into those markets from a business standpoint, right? And, now you're part of a larger organization that doesn't really care that much about consciousness, right? And so there's been this change over the last 10 or 15 years or so among these schools. And CIHS is really one of the last ones standing, maybe the last one standing with PhD programs that hasn't veered off its core mission. Even CIS, where I went, which I love, it's an amazing school. They do a lot of incredible work there. I'm working with them even, today on significant stuff, right? But they've really, if you sort of look at where they've gone a lot towards diversity and, the sort of the DEI stuff, the diversity, the equity, the inclusion, the social justice stuff, more so than the consciousness. And, I think you've probably had Leslie Combs on the show, Alan Leslie Combs on the show. If not, he's a great consciousness scholar. Be a good person to have on. He was basically the main consciousness professor at CIS, retired here recently. He was also at Ben's thing in Panama, and we were having dinner. Somebody asked him about, consciousness studies at CIS, and he was like, "What consciousness studies?" It's like, by the time that I left, it was all this other stuff. And so I think that's happened a lot in the space. And I felt like I do have a very successful background in organizations and in building things. And I really felt like, there needs to be a surviving consciousness hub within the academic world that is dedicated to it, focused on it, hasn't been co-opted or watered down or veered off into other missions or whatever else. And so, I knew that that was part of what was behind that intuition. But I also, since taking over, have realized that there was another piece of that as well, which is that I don't think that there's much of I don't frankly think there's a lot of progress being made in the consciousness space from a research standpoint, or even the parapsychology space as a subset of that space. We were talking a little bit about that before the show started. People can watch this back and they can probably see that conversation. Maybe it was before we were recording, I don't know. But the part of that is that, there isn't, I think, strong pipelines for that in the academy at this point, right? I mean, if you want to get a degree in parapsychology in America, where are you going to go for that? Where are you going to learn to do good research on that? Where are you going to learn to do good transpersonal psychology research from somebody that really cared? And so we brought in Glenn Hartilius, who is as hardcore as it gets, the best guy. We only want the best people, right? He was the best guy in the world, as far as I'm concerned, at putting together things like a transpersonal psychology program.
Can you define
In terms of
transpersonal?
hardcore research outcomes, and things like that. So go ahead.
Oh, Jeff, a lot of our viewers may not know what transpersonal psychology is. How is it different from any other branch of psychology?
Sure. There's been these different waves of psychology or focuses of psychology over time, basically. And you could say that within the last few of them, probably the most recent is like cognitive neuropsychology and stuff like that, with the advent of very powerful measurement tools for the brain and nervous system. One that arose around the late 1960s, early 1970s, driven by Abraham Maslow, who I know you knew, and Tony Sidich, who probably was also on your show and you probably also knew. Those two, they were coming out of humanistic psychology. They were, they're also, central to the foundation of kind of the wave of psychology that was new before that, called humanistic psychology. And they began to sort of suspect that there was something that had been lumped into humanistic psychology, which is a lot of the stuff that we study. It's the Enlightenment stuff. It's the, it's the non-duality stuff, the persistent mystical stuff, whatever else. Maslow was very famous for having studied peak experiences, which included like temporary glimpses of these types of things. He had a series of categories that something had to meet to be considered a valid peak experience. And they more or less matched the categories that someone like Stace would come up for mystical experiences or whatever else, right? And so he felt at the time, not at the very end of his career, but towards the end of his career, the middle end of his career, he really felt that the highest peak of human experience was sort of self-actualization plus transcending the self itself. And he had different ways that he talked about that. If you think about that, that's, sort of the classic peak mystical type experience, right? And he felt that that would change someone's values. He was big into motivations and values and things like that. He felt that that would change people's motivations and values to be more community oriented, more giving, less selfish, that type of thing, right? Because you sort of have this unity of experience, and now you realize, oh, I'm everything. Why, selfishness now means helping everybody, right? Instead of just being out for myself. Right? So a very oversimplification of his ideas, but the gist. So he wound up having a transition himself to what we call persistent non-symbolic experience, what is more commonly called enlightenment, or persistent mystical experience, or unity consciousness, or whatever else. And as we talked about on one of the earlier interviews with you, Stan Krippner wound up being on the panel where he was talking about that, and thank goodness, paid to have that transcripted and put into a journal. And so we actually have Maslow's own words for how he viewed the peak experience versus what he called the plateau experience, which was the more persistent type of the experience. And through all of this, he really just, I think, kind of came to realize this is a different ball of wax. We've been trying to fit this stuff into humanistic psychology for a long time. It's going to need its own psychology. And so we better start one. And so he and Tony CIHS were really sort of the drivers of that. Now, Maslow died in June of 1970, about 6 days before I was born, actually. Mm-hmm. And, so he couldn't drive it forward the way he would have really wanted it to. CIHS did drive it forward as best he could. But transpersonal psychology never really fully took hold in America the way it could have. I'd say it's been a controversial psychological science for a lot of its existence, especially in the American Academy. It's a little bit more accepted in the UK Academy and in some other parts of the world. And so that's really what it deals with. It deals with these transcendent states primarily. And so it had the drug stuff then put into it, especially through the 1970s, and a lot of the meditation stuff that was dealing with transcendent stuff, and more or less anything that, was transcendent of the ego in some way, sort of like was the realm of transpersonal psychology. And now this stuff is studied everywhere, right? I mean, it's super mainstream. And it's in a lot of the neuroscience stuff. It's in the psychedelic stuff is all mainstream. The meditation stuff is all mainstream. There's people being, scanned at Ivy League universities all over the place that experience these transcendent experiences and whatever else. In a way, the fire that transpersonal psychology lit is now spread throughout the mainstream academy.
Well, if transpersonal psychology is everywhere, and to some sense, I know it is, what distinguishes CIHS? How will you be different from the other psychology programs that are looking at these things?
Well, there really aren't a lot of psychology programs that look at these things. So although they're spread out throughout the academy, they're spread out in research labs, very sporadically throughout the academy. So it's made it into the mainstream labs. There's labs at Harvard, there's people doing this stuff at Penn, which are more or less like the top couple of Ivy League schools, right? There's people looking at this stuff at Stanford, a place that I've been affiliated with, and which is I think in the latest rankings, the top school in America, as an example. And so even at these very top places, you have people that are looking into it, but you don't have programs. You don't have places where you can go to learn to do that. And it was really interesting, these were the schools that were drawn from when the psychedelic people started to do their research. Because it's sort of like, let's say that you're a senior professor at Johns Hopkins or something, at Johns Hopkins, right?
Right.
And you're like, okay, I need to staff up my lab with people that understand this type of stuff. And you kind of looking around, and ordinarily what you do at a major institution, right, is you get people from the same tier of school as you, and you more or less just trade your students around. You keep them all at the top level so that it advances everybody's careers. And it's kind of like an insider club kind of thing, frankly. But you're looking around and you're like, okay, well, none of these other schools are turning out the people I need, right? And so, you wind up with people from the schools that had programs in transpersonal psychology, getting pulled in because they were trained, for it. And so even now, those schools really don't have training. They don't have the programs. They've got the research stuff is scattered all over the place at this point, but you can't go get a degree in it,
Well, we've got a number of questions coming in. Emmy, do you want to choose one?
I do. I just want, Jeffrey Martin, you just said a lot there. And the title of this live stream is Frontiers of Consciousness Research. And so before we move to some of the questions that are coming in from the chat, I'm just curious, because it sounds like you're saying that there's opportunity for more research. Can you share, what do you think are some significant contributions in this area that you are a fan of, or that you think you would like the listeners to know about? I know you mentioned the well-being. That's significant, right? Because people want to be happy. And is there anything else that you want to share? Are there other types of research that you think are worthy of highlighting, or?
Yeah, I think there are, but I think an even better message goes to the first part of your comment, which is that this is a wide open opportunity space that is, for the most part, empty of people pursuing it. There are very few people in this space contributing to it in any meaningful way. As we were talking about, again, I don't remember if we were recording or not, but last year I was doing the Society for Consciousness Studies conference, right? And that's, the conference, that's the society that has all the big names, and they're on down to the students, all the way down to the new students and whatnot in it, that are into sort of this type of stuff, our type of stuff. Jeffrey is a member, as an example. And so, you look on the listservs and you look at who's commenting, and, it's an incredible who's who of people. And so that's an interesting conference, I think, every year. And since it's gone virtual at the end of, when COVID hit, we just made it virtual. So I've been organizing it. I'm the vice president of that society. And so I've been organizing this conference during COVID, keeping it virtual. And last year, I thought to myself, what we should do is we should do a conference that just highlights all the recent breakthroughs that have been made out there. And so I sent out an email to everybody, basically saying, this is what I want to do this year. Let's just feature maybe 7, 10 speakers, give you a lot of time to talk about the breakthrough. I didn't get a breakthrough. There wasn't one person who was like, here's my incredible breakthrough. I'm so excited to be able to talk about this. So then I was like, okay, well, how about if we do a conference that like stimulates people's ideas around here are the breakthroughs that could be happening, right? And so I was like, so how about just send me your ideas and we'll maybe have some more. We'll just cut the time down so you don't have a long time to talk. But we'll just it'll be like a breakthrough pitch fest, again, more or less crickets, right? And so one of the things that I think is most distressing about the frontier of consciousness studies, consciousness science, is sort of the lack of breakthroughs that are being made in it. That doesn't mean, it's sort of like the guy from the Royal Academy around the turn of the century that just to paraphrase, basically was like, well, we've discovered everything meaningful to discover at this point, look how awesome science is, right? That's not why the breakthroughs aren't being made. Right? There's nothing but amazing breakthroughs waiting to happen, right? But there's frankly just not enough bodies really going after it. You've got a lot of the people who did create and have had phenomenal careers and have done amazing breakthroughs in this stuff are kind of aging out. They're getting up there in years at this point. And there hasn't really been much of a pipeline coming in behind them. And so I think the headline from the frontiers of consciousness studies, frankly, is that, this is an area that needs a lot more people to come into it and to devote their lives to it and to, do the types of projects that really do, in fact, move the ball forward. There is a tremendous opportunity here for impact. And it's really, it's just not happening. Even, I was.
Can I just add to something really, which we probably
Sure.
could have said at the top, and Jeff, maybe you were about to say this as well, Jeffrey Mishlove, that is that California Institute for Human Science is now the official sponsor of New Thinking Aloud. And having you here is also a way to inspire those who are interested to explore these topics. And I just want to add from my experience working in this realm for a number of years, being a co-host now on New Thinking Aloud, officially for 2 years, going on 3 years, helping Jeff pretty much almost weekly with interviews myself, is that there is a lot of research out there. But it sounds like you're making a call for more research as well. Because I just want to offer that there is research out there. I don't know, Jeffrey Mishlove, what would you like to say about that?
Well, here's a question that's come in from one of our volunteers, Elizabeth Lord, who happens to be a board member of the Rhine Research Center in Durham.
Great. Yeah, great example.
And she is quoting Russell Targ. We just published a book of 15 interviews with Russell Targ, who turned 90 recently. And he said, it's easier to get funding if your educational focus is in anything else but parapsychology. And I would add any other area of the paranormal, but those are the real frontier areas. Those are the breakthrough areas. Eyeless sight is a great example of an area where there are tens of thousands of people getting trained in eyeless sight. Amazing opportunities for research. But if you talk to people who are trying to get funding to do those studies, they're afraid if they even hint at doing paranormal research, they might lose their job.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, their job, if they're already in the academy with a normal faculty position or something, for sure. Like I remember in 2006, I went to basically hang out for a bit with Bob and Brenda Dunn from Paralab, right? And they just wrapped up research, right? And so I was really wanting to get from the horse's mouth, so to speak, what they really thought of the previous couple of decades, not what they wrote, not what they were publicly saying. And so they wound up at the time, they were being at the SSE convention for that year. And so I found myself at the SSE convention.
Society
for
for
that.
Scientific Exploration.
Society for Scientific Exploration, exactly. And it was fascinating because I was just, I knew a bunch of people there. I hadn't been to one of those meetings before. And people asked me, how come you haven't been to one of these meetings? And I said, well, look, I mean, I'm pretty new to this academy thing, and I'm not wanting to shoot myself in the foot reputationally by, getting a reputation for hanging out at places like SSE, right? Or the Parapsychology Association or wherever, right? And I was talking to one of their board members about this because she was like, well, but, it's people like you that you need or whatever else. And I'm like, well, tell me what happens to young faculty members that show up and join here, right? And she's like, well, and I said, look, I've just been knocking around here and I heard a guy recently lost his job, a new young assistant professor because of his association here. Like, these are real threats, right? And she's like, well, yeah. But it's not a but. If you, look, I was in a good situation, right? I didn't have to work. I had made a lot of money. I had a very successful run. I could fund my own research. I was in a very unique situation to be able to accomplish what we could have never accomplished this probably if those things weren't true, right? What we've done in our research to this point. But even with that, I was still careful of, coming too close to these things for many, many years in my career. And I think that's a very legitimate concern. You have to make a decision from an academic standpoint. You really have to make a decision of what it is that you actually want. If you want to become a mainstream professor somewhere and to climb the ranks, get out of school, get out of PhD school, go be a postdoc somewhere for a period of years, then, luck into an assistant professorship somewhere, then climb to associate, then full professor, then retire with a pension. If that's your goal, this is probably the wrong thing to be interested in, frankly, at this point for that goal. And so if you're in the academy, you're terrified lots of times of being associated. In the early years of our research, we've kind of legitimized the research, I think, very much at this point. And I was really careful with where I associated with for a very, very long time, right? And that provided a lot of cover because of our research results, and they could be used by people and stuff. And so it's changed a lot over the years that we've been doing this on our side, on the PNSE side, on the persistent non-symbolic side. But in the early days, we had all kinds of amazing collaborators at institutions all over the world who were like, under no circumstances can you tell anybody that I'm doing this. We come into the MRI lab on the nights and weekends, and we'll scan some people, and we'll analyze the research, and under no circumstances can you ever say where those results came from. Because they knew, like, they were going to get painted with it. It was good, even though they were senior people, they were worried about it impacting their grants that they could get from the NIH and from other major grant sources, and they just didn't want to be seen as weird, right? So I get that, and that is correct, and that is a legitimate concern. But if you're not pursuing that I never pursued that. I don't care about that. I mean, I wound up being associated with different places that were, like Stanford, right? It's a legit place. It's a real place. And all of that. It's top of the game in America. And that's great. But I never set out to do anything like that or to have any sort of career like that. What I set out to do was just to figure some stuff out and to try, initially for me, right, to just make myself happier. And then once that wound up working out pretty well, it seemed like, well, now we've got all this stuff, we should try to help people with it. And so it became more about impact. I think you really have to be that type of person. You have to want the answers to this stuff. And you have to be after more impact and more sort of truth oriented than you are just sort of wanting a traditional career inside of wherever. However, if you do that, if you do go in that direction, there is considerable support out there for this stuff. There was a lot of support on the psychedelics. It's not NIH stuff, right? It's not the stuff that gets you from being an assistant professor to being an associate professor at MIT or something, right? Because you've got to have the right grant sources for that. A lot of things have to be exactly right according to what's quote unquote right from a mainstream standpoint, right? But if you just want to do work in this space, there's so much money in this world and so many people who are interested in the answers, and they're not going to go back. They're not going to do what I did, right? They're not going to go back to school and go seeking those answers themselves. They hand out checks and they try to get it done that way, basically. And so there's actually plenty of money, I think, for researching all kinds of this stuff in the consciousness space. What there's more of a lack of, frankly, is high quality, researchers being willing to really sort of, do it. Because there's only so much you can do, I mean, even if you think about someone like a Dean Radin, Dean is wonderful and I love Dean. He's only one person. Like, how many projects can that guy do at a time? Not that many. Right. And so, he's like, he comes off of one project and it's, this is my next project. And that's great. But it's not like there's 100 Dean Radins out there, that are all doing all kinds of stuff in parallel. There's no shortage of stuff that can be done. And you're right. There's a lot of research that's done, but a lot of it is still, I would argue, very, very incremental. And that's another thing that you wind up with in sort of the mainstream of the academy, right? It's a business, and there's two ways to make money at that business. One is student tuition, and the other is, well, there's three: donations, and the other is research money, right? And so research funds come in, a certain percentage of those research funds go to overhead to fund the university, to pay for the researcher's salary, to pay for the space, all of that kind of stuff, right? And so that's a big, big business. And it is a business. And scientists at institutions are, in a way, sort of their own entrepreneurs, where they've got to write the grants and bring in the money and be doing stuff that's interesting enough, right, on the one hand, but then they've also got to meet the tenets of their institution. You wind up with what I talked about earlier, which is like a lot of incrementalism, and so you wind up with a lot of research, but it's a lot of very incrementalism type research. It's not a lot of like really amazing swing for the fences breakthrough type research. And part of that is because you don't want to fail. You can get incremental successful research published, but you can't get very easily a failed research project published, right? And so it's just a lot safer. You know where you can probably get your next win in an incremental way. You can see how it's going to go. You can tell the journal that's going to take it. You know that like you're going to be making progress in your career if you go this direction, right? Whereas the people that are out there winning Nobel Prizes and stuff, they've had really different careers in most cases. They haven't thought like that. They haven't been like that. They've had very high risk academic careers for the most part, where they've really swung for the fences. And that's what I think we need a lot more of inside of the consciousness space. But it's tricky to do, right? Because you're already looked upon like, well, I don't know, are you even doing science? I mean, what is this stuff, that you're into in the first place? And then to try to like decide that you're just going to swing for the fences in it instead of playing the safe incremental, game of how you build your career or whatnot. That's an even bigger decision than it is for the Nobel guys that were swinging in their own very established fields. So, you're right. There's a lot of research out there that is happening, but I'm talking about the really sort of groundbreaking stuff. But also the other thing that you don't see is a lot of applied research. So, one of the things I remember Dean wrote in one of his books, I can't remember which one it was, but it was like the last chapter or something of one of his books. He basically, said, look, we've done more than enough research to show that this psi stuff is real. Right. I mean, statistically, it's just like, you can't look at this stuff and think, well, maybe, I don't know. I mean, it could be, right? He's like, look, it's just like an overwhelming amount of statistical evidence at this point, right? He's like, so why don't people care? Like, why is it, that people aren't shouting from the rooftops, oh my God, psychic phenomenon is real, people, right?
We are here at New Thinking Aloud.
Right, you guys are, right? But like,
Yeah.
how come, like you turn on the nightly news and, Lester Holt or whoever the anchor at NBC, my old stomping ground, is these days, isn't being like, and, for today's size segment, we're going to be just, I mean, it's just like, it's not out there in the mainstream, really, right? Why is that? And Dean made a very convincing case that it's because you can't really do anything with it that's practical yet. It's not really practical
Oh my,
in
so much you can do
people's lives.
with it, but a lot of
Right.
people maybe don't see that connection yet. Absolutely, that you can.
And so, like, I was with Fred Travis, the main neuroscience guy at Maharishi University, and he was telling me about, he was doing some of like Dean's presentiment stuff or whatever. And I'm like, this is a pretty big departure for you, Fred. What are you doing? What are you doing this for? And I'm like, and he's like, well, frankly, we're trying to do stuff that'll catch people's attention and maybe get them excited. And I'm like, well, your lab has done a ton of stuff around happiness and all of that. And he's like, yeah, well, people don't seem to really care that much about happiness. We're looking for something more potentially impactful, more headline grabbing, right? And something that we could maybe turn into something more applied, which you could argue the presentiment area is something that it would seem logical that you could turn that into something more applied, right? And so there are people out there here and there that are working on the applied front, but I mean, these are really safe people, like Fred Travis is not going to be fired by MUM anytime soon, right? And Dean Radin isn't going to be let go of anytime soon by IONS or whatever else, right? And so the other area where I think people really should focus, but it's not an area that you get rewarded for in the academy, generally speaking, especially not the areas of the academy that usually deal with this stuff, is applying this stuff. It's the applied science side of it, and so that's a huge, it's just a huge, wide open area.
Can I ask a
That
question?
almost nobody is going into.
Can I ask a question related to that about your own research, Jeffrey Martin? We have a viewer with numbers and letters, and to bring it back home for people, how they can use this in their own lives, back to your well-being, transcendence into enlightenment. They ask, what is the Hertz frequencies of enlightenment zones? They're asking for, beta, gamma, so brainwave, how much hertz and so forth. And they're just looking for something maybe to help with the science part, but also if you have any comments on your own research and how people can use that, or what did you find that helped people? Because I think a lot of people do want to be happy. And of course, there's all sorts of headlines out there, clickbait, all of this, because people are vying for everybody's attention. Is there anything you can share with people that would help them to feel maybe perhaps a bit more enlightened, or how they can move in that direction?
Yeah, sure. So frequency-wise, that's an interesting question. I'd say that hasn't been nailed down terribly tightly yet in any specific technology. And so maybe it's been nailed down the most with focused transcranial ultrasound, but the problem is you can't use it, really. You have, it's not FDA approved. There's no device out there that you can just go and put on your head at home. You have to go to somebody that, is a professional neuroscientist and participate in an experiment at this point somewhere, in order to make that work for you. And so, but there are, that is an area that I think is probably the most promising technology out there. But unfortunately, it's also a pretty inaccessible technology. So beyond that, if I were someone out there, what I would do is I would look for a light-based headset, because on our team, in our sphere, Our chief clinician for many years has been a guy named Sanjay Manchanda, who you can Google. And his stuff will come right up, and you can ping him and ask him about this, and probably get a device from him that you can use at home. And it's basically going to be a light-based device. It's going to use very specific frequencies of light that go through what are called the therapeutic windows into the brain. What a therapeutic window means is that, your skin and your muscle and your skull and stuff don't stop it. None of those act as a filter for that particular frequency of light. And so the light can actually make it all the way into and work on the brain and the brain's cells and stuff itself. So in that case, you're talking about very high frequencies, much higher than you could ever get at with something like an EEG neurofeedback system or something like that, right? I mean, you're really in the thousands of hertz. And just the way EEG works with sampling rates and stuff like that, I mean, it's going to top out between 100 and 200 hertz. So it can't even do neurofeedback at these levels. That's my answer. And Sanjay can, I'm sure he'll provide guidance on, here's the settings, here's how to program it, and here's the settings to use, and here's the frequencies for it, and all of that, right? And it's not quite as simple as you just go for the super high ones. It's good to mix in some low ones as well. We were just talking about that on the phone the other day. But anyway, he's a great guy to go to for that. There's not a lot of people that are working in that space, and we've been working in that space for a very, very long time. Even went over to that headset that he would probably recommend. I went over to China actually to source that headset to build the relationship with and to get them to make custom versions for us, that did the frequencies that we needed and all of that stuff. And so there is stuff like that out there for sure. Now for our stuff, we wound up making the protocol available for pre-post. I reached the point, I want to say it was maybe somewhere around 2015 or 2016, where I was just tired of spending all of my own money on the research. I've been doing that since like 2006. And I thought, this money isn't going to last forever. I'm basically paying people to come to us and get enlightened. That seems nuts. There's all kinds of people who are interested in doing this. And so we started to broaden the research out to the wider world. And initially, I think we charged participants like $2,000 or $3,000 or something like that, maybe to participate. We did a pilot, I think that was maybe $100 or $150 or something like that for 6 people to test sort of that online class idea. And see if we could just, transition people in sort of an online educational type of way. And that wound up working really, really well. And so we've created a series of continually refined programs like that. I don't have really anything to do with those anymore. You can go to Fundamental Wellbeing Foundation. There's a nonprofit basically that runs the last iteration of those that was created. It's a very, very successful protocol, and people can just go and basically sign up for that and just do exactly what it says and not think that you know better and change the protocol and then not have it work as well for you. Just a little tip there, just do exactly what it says. Let the research work for you. Let all of those many, many years of, blood, sweat, tears, and treasury pay off in your own life. So that's the easiest way, and if there were a couple of headlines from that, if they don't want to do that, then frankly, a lot of the traditional meditation stuff is effective. And I don't care if it's centering prayer from Christianity or contemplative, like, sort of love-based devotional prayer from a faith tradition. I don't care if it's watching your breath or some, mantra-based thing, it really doesn't matter to me. There's a lot of very well-refined practices out there. And the reality is that for anyone that's watching, the vast majority of those will not work for them. However, a tiny, tiny percentage of those will work for them. And so the trick to our protocol was that we basically sorted down to the ones that were, most likely to work for somebody. And then over the course of a series of weeks, the initial protocol was like 4 months. And so like every week for 4 months, sometimes twice a week, we would switch them out. You would basically do a different method, a different class of method that was sort of the best method of that class that we'd found that impacted the most Western English speaking people, right? And you were just looking for a matching process. You were just looking for a fit, because it really shouldn't take more than a week or so of using a method that's a good fit for you to transition. It's not one of those things that needs to take a lifetime. It only needs to take a lifetime if you haven't found what works for you.
And can
And
you
so
just
you're
share
looking for the
what you
thing
mean
that
by
sort of matches up.
transition? What you mean by transition for those who might be new to that term and how you use it?
Sure. I mean, transition to what people would think of as some form of higher level consciousness, quote unquote. We've got, if you go to nonsymbolic.org or you read the Finder's book, but it's all the updated stuff is at nonsymbolic.org. It's way more up to date than the book is. If you just go there and read it, it'll lay out everything. It'll show you all the different types.
We just re-released our prior video with you.
Oh, there you go. I will do it too.
Transitioning to Enlightenment, that covers a lot of that. It's in our archive right now. I think it was just released last week.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Yep.
Perfect. And I think that we've also did one where we talked about the different types, the main 4 early types that more or less everybody will fall into. It's not very many people that go further than the first 4 types of this. Though more and more over time, because we've been working on how to do that, and knowledge of how to do that is gotten out there now more and stuff like that. But so the first thing that you really just need to do is, if you don't want to use the shortcut from the protocol at FWF, and we're working on a book to just put this out there. Conglay Wang is doing a great job. She's basically taking the original sort of most full 4-month protocol and just translating into a book so people can just read it and follow along with it, and so we want this stuff to be out there, but at the same time, it's not what I'm working on, on a day-to-day basis, or it's other people are sort of taking it and running with it at this point. But if you were just to boil down like a couple of key points, the one is you just got to find what works for you, right? So if you've meditated for an hour a day for a week using some method and it hasn't had a significant impact on you, then get rid of it and try another one. And, just go through major ones that seem to have worked for people, that have lasted for, the test of time. Or if you want a newer one that's really good, go to Headless Way. Richard Lang's stuff is fantastic. His continuation of Douglas Harding's work. You just search Google Headless Way and it's all free. You can learn how to do it. That works really well for a lot of people. So there's a lot of stuff like that. The other thing is you're only doing these practices to get a glimpse. I think there's a huge disservice that's done in the traditional instruction around meditation and whatnot, where it's sort of like oftentimes the instruction is just keep doing the meditation, and whatever happens, whatever arises, whatever sort of just, even if it's an amazing experience, just keep doing the meditation, right? And we found that actually that doesn't make any sense from a brain standpoint, from like a neuroscientist type standpoint, really. And so what we found is that you want to use these just to get to a glimpse of something, and then you want to put your attention on that and sink into it, basically. And I have a very short analogy for sinking in. It's something like you imagine that you're in a bathtub, right? And it's warm and it just feels wonderful, right? How is it that you personally engage with a bathtub? There's different ways people can do it, right? One way is the way that I just mentioned. It's warm, it feels amazing, and you just kind of let yourself just melt into it. Just put your attention on how it feels, right? And it just keeps probably feeling better and better and better and better until it starts to cool off and you have to add more hot water or something, right? But for a while there, you can just sort of sink in and really enjoy it, right? And then there's, you can be analytical while you're taking a bath, right? And so you can get in the bathtub and you can think to yourself, okay, well, yes, this is comfortable and warm. Yeah, I can feel the comfortable and warm thing, but well, let's see, how am I going to sit here? Should I cross my legs this way or that way? Which way gets most of my skin in? Okay, maybe it's this way. And is it cooling off already? Maybe I should add some more hot water. Yeah, let's add some more hot water now. Now I better, well, it's getting too full. Let me let some of the cold water out, maybe the bottom, we'll let the hot water, and it's this very mental, analytical process, right? That's not what you want to do. That's not sinking in, right? So you want to think of sinking in. When you experience anything, it doesn't have to be a warm bath. You can experience anything, whatever you're experiencing right now, even just listening to my voice, you can just allow yourself to sink into that, right? You don't have to have sort of that analytical framework engaged. You can just sink in and experience what it is. And so if you find a meditation method or a cognitive science-based method more like Headless Way or whatever else, that provides you with a glimpse that's solidly in the direction of these types of experiences, what we would call non-symbolic experiences. When it gives you that glimpse, when it gives you that experience, stop doing the practice and just sink into it. And don't go back to the practice unless you lose the feeling of it, because basically the brain is going to prioritize what you're paying attention to. Right. And so you kind of communicate with your brain what you want more of by what you're paying attention to. And if you just have experiencing something in the direction of a non-symbolic or persistent non-symbolic experience, and you take time to stop and put your attention on that when it happens, your brain is sort of like, well, Jeffrey usually seems to care a lot about thinking about chocolate. I usually try to get Jeffrey a lot of chocolate. Maybe he wants less chocolate now, and maybe he wants more of this type of experience, right? And then it starts to produce that type of experience instead of thinking, oh, I think I'll get up and get some chocolate right now, or whatever, right? And so those, I think, are two really, really important findings. You've got to find your fit, and then you've got to use it, not thinking, oh, it's how great I get at concentrating on my breath, and someday, boom, a switch will just flip when I've finally mastered concentration. When I can count to 3 million breaths without a distraction, I bet you I'll be in fundamental well-being, or PNSE, persistent non-symbolic experience. And that's just not the way it works. What you want to think of is when it starts to give you something in the right experience, sink into that, communicate to your nervous system right away. This is what matters.
So thank you for that. We're at the top of the hour, so we just have 30 minutes left, and we have lots of questions for you coming in. So hopefully we can get to a few more of those in the 30 minutes we have remaining. I just want to also add that before you gave that great answer, the topic was also about applying psi functioning, if you will, what's been found in parapsychology. And one of our volunteers, Elizabeth Lord, has suggested that remote viewing and dowsing are also two types of psi-oriented skills that have been, she says, making money for people. And I just also want to add myself as a professional intuitive and one who studied this and have taught people meditation for a number of years, even in the acute setting of the hospital, and got pain and anxiety levels down, in addition to people getting into states like you're talking about, even in under 15, 20 minutes. And actually, in a majority of the patients that I worked with, that would happen. So that there are practical applications for this. When we get into those states, it seems that then our intuition can be more heightened. And so we can access getting information that can also assist our lives. So I just want to add that there can be very practical applications. Jeff, are there any burning questions that you're seeing coming through that you want to ask Jeffrey?
Christopher Naughton,
yes,
who is a guest host on the New Thinking Aloud channel, has posted a question, and he asks you, Jeffrey, do you believe that the ongoing UFO UAP disclosure, especially after the first stage information release of the October 18 Disclosure Act, could possibly impact opening up psi research or consciousness research in general. And I know that CIHS now has a program on non-human intelligence. I think it's the only one in the country, maybe in the world, offered by an accredited university. So that's a far cry from the physiological studies we've been talking about so far. How does that fit in?
Yeah, absolutely. That's Sean Hargan's project, basically, and it's in Integral Noetic Sciences is the school within the university that he runs. And a lot of the stuff that Emmy mentioned a minute ago as well is in that program as well. From a studying standpoint. And I think, she, just to touch a little bit on her comment first, I think she makes a very good case, right? That's the thing. There is a lot of possibility for applying this stuff and for more, for getting that more accepted, getting that more viable, getting that more regular, however we want to think about or say that. It's being done kind of all over the place, really. And yet it's not that recognized, right? Yeah. And so there's just so much that can be done in this space. So on the UAP stuff, I'm not a great, expert on this by any stretch of the imagination. It's sort of one of those things where it's in the ether of my social circles or professional circles or whatever else. But my sense is that, especially, from Sean's direction and also from Thomas's direction, going over to ions. Ions is also going into this area now. And so the sense is that I can pick up, the sense is that the people that are really at the top of that area have for quite some time been going under the assumption that this is a consciousness related thing. Way more than it is like, aliens from Zeta Reticuli or, whatever else, that there is a heavy consciousness related component to it. I remember I was watching a podcast that Sean did the other day, and he gave this great example where he said, you've got three people, they're sitting on the back of a truck and they're just kind of hanging out in some farm field or something. And some anomalous phenomenon shows up, right? And one person sees it as a UFO. And, another person doesn't see a thing, right? And the third person sees it as like an orb, right? So you got three people staring at the same point in space, seeing three completely different things. I mean, if that doesn't suggest that there's a consciousness phenomena related angle, to this, of stories like that, I mean, they're just so indicative of this. And so you have the people that are sort of at the top of this, really, I think, my understanding is that they've been really sort of trying to figure out how to get that message out there. They talk about it all the time amongst themselves. But, it's, if you're like doing a Discovery Channel show as a producer, you don't care about that, right? You want the cool, and then when did the aliens abduct you, or whatever else, right? And so they're kind of fighting what the mainstream aspects of the media and whatnot want out of this, and the other interest groups and whatever else. But they're sort of like, from an inside baseball standpoint, they're like, this has got to be about consciousness. And so I think that's what my answer would be to that. And that's why it's important for us to have it at the university, and for us to, it's a very, very avant-garde area for us to incubate and put resources into and provide education around and all of that. We're very fortunate to have Sean doing that. I think he's absolutely excellent at it. And so, it's consciousness to us.
In fact, I might mention that on Tuesday, August 6th, we will be releasing a repeat of the video with Sean on non-human intelligence and how he relates it to his background, his extensive background in integral theory. And maybe we should mention integral theory for a moment as well, because it's so central to the educational approach at CIHS.
That's true. Let me just briefly give a plug for Sean's research project. Superexperiencer.org is the URL. So superexperiencer.org. And there's like a preliminary survey for the research. He's basically trying to collect together people that have a lot of experiences of these types of phenomena for us to do a lot more research on. Very much like the research that we did, or that had really never been done before our project on people that experience persistent non-symbolic experience. It's sort of like repeating that same pathway for people who are experiencing this type of phenomenon. Yeah, integral is a big deal. Sean, of course, was very close to Ken Wilber, ran one of his main academic journals for a long time. And so when he thinks integral, he thinks Ken Wilber. Now, if you jump over to Glenn and the psychology program, right? When Glenn thinks integral, Glenn doesn't think Ken Wilber, right? Because Ken Wilber is a philosopher to Glenn. So, Glenn thinks about integral psychology from a very different lens. And I think you've got that great diversity within our institution, where you have a high-level word like integral, but even at a department level, it's being interpreted in different ways through different lenses, which are, of course, just different ways of construing and making meaning and understanding things and stuff like that. And so you've got a much more scientific version of it, and from a social scientific standpoint, in a program like Glenn's psychology program, which is called Integral, Transpersonal, and Positive Psychology, a PhD in that, and also at the master's level that he has a program. And then Sean's program was really, Sean took over what was really a religion and philosophy and spirituality type school and program, and, revamped it and modernized it. And sort of took it to the next level, right? So in that context, Wilbur is I love Ken. He's a great guy, and he's a wonderful thinker. And what he's done is inside all of our heads, he's absolutely influenced how all of us think, in some way. And that's really saying something, when you've got more or less everybody in a field that has been influenced by some, there's little pieces of Ken Wilber in all of our machinery. That's an incredible success, really. But it has been a success from the philosophy side of things, not from the science side of things, not from the research-driven side of things or anything like that. And so that fits very well inside of a philosophy, religion, spirituality type of school and department like Sean's. And so, yeah, integral, but integral in all of its various facets is key to the school. It's more or less in every school's name. Even we have an integral health program, for instance, which is, again, even different in its interpretation of integral, because it's oriented towards health and not towards social science and not towards, more of a philosophical orientation. So it's very cool. It's very cool.
We have a question from a viewer named Yelis Bolgursu. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, who asks, is there any data showing that the happy people you studied know why they are on Earth?
Purpose, meaning and purpose, something like that.
Meaning and purpose, yes. I've for years I said, if you want to, so people would come to me and they'd be like, you put on such huge successful conferences and stuff, like I want to put on conferences, like what do you think I should do? And I'm like, you should do conferences on meaning and purpose. Like anyone can do a conference on meaning and purpose and it'll like fill up to the brim. Everybody's like so interested in meaning and purpose. What's interesting is that after the transition to fundamental well-being, you just don't care about meaning and purpose anymore. Meaning and purpose really is much more of an egoic type of thing. It's the ego that cares about what's my purpose. It's the ego that's trying to figure out the meaning of this, that, or the other, answer the great existential questions of life. When you get to any degree of depth in fundamental well-being, basically that falls away, and there's just no interest It's just, you just don't even, people want to talk to you about philosophy or whatever, and you listen to them and you sort of humor them to be polite, but you could care less.
But isn't it important for people to know what their purpose is in life at some level?
Not.
You don't think there's no reason to know what your purpose is for being here?
No.
Just being is really, so, okay. It's an interesting perspective.
Yeah. Well, the thing about purpose, right, is if you really dig into that research, what you're going to discover basically is that it's kind of a false hole to go down. Like, so somebody, you might be like, oh, I figured out my purpose, and you could be really, really convinced of it, right? And then I'll check in with you like 5 years later, and I'll be like, hey, how's your purpose going? What's your purpose? And it'll be like a totally different purpose, right? And so one of the things that's confusing, I think, about purposes is that they change so much. And people will be like, oh, I've totally found my purpose. And yet they're like still really like into meaning and purpose and trying to figure out meaning and purpose and exploring meaning and purpose and whatever else. It's really like a false sort of construct. Now, from an egoic standpoint, look, if you're not going to transition to fundamental well-being, to PNSE, you spend a lot of time on meaning and purpose probably, and just go with it. Do whatever you have to do to sort of give yourself some psychological relief on that. And if you think that you found your purpose, great. Like I said, we'll catch up with you in 5 or 10 years and we'll see what your meaning and purpose is then. But I don't think it's that healthy, frankly, because it's all sort of part of that, that sort of egoic side of things that doesn't really promote happiness per se. One of the things that was really funny about our research was we'd have these, it always happened. People would we have pre and post surveys for something like the protocol that transitioned people, right? And I mean, in the early days, we really made people earn their ability to take the protocol. Sometimes there were like 8 hours of psychology measures like going into it, right? But we had like every possible well-being measure and meaning measure and you name it at one point. We rotated through them, once we had enough data to answer the questions around it. And on these happiness measures, sometimes people would come in really happy, right? Even in the pilot study, there was a lady who came in and she was like really, in fact, we picked 2 really happy people, 2 medium happy people, and 2 more or less suicidally depressed type people for the pilot, so that we had a range of diversity of men and women, some international diversity, etc. But we wanted diversity of happiness for the pilot study on the first protocol. And so this one of them, the lady comes in and she's like super happy, right? Can't imagine, maxes out all the happiness scores, whatever else. And she's the first one to transition, right? So somewhere through the program, I don't remember where it was, she transitions to PNSE, and she's doing her mid-course or her after-course measures. I don't remember, we did mid-course ones back then too. We stopped doing that at a certain point. And she writes and she's like, I'm so sorry, because she's like, I thought I knew what happiness was. And I thought like, I was so happy. Like I was like the happiest person. I was just so happy. She's like, now I realize I wasn't even close to happy. She's like, can I go back to like my earlier measure, like my pre-measure, and take that again and estimate how happy I was based on where I'm currently at? Because otherwise I don't think that'll show a difference in your data. Now I'm going to say the same thing that I said going in, but it's like totally different in terms of my happiness level. And that was so common. We heard that from people all the time during that research, and we were like, no, you can't go back to the earlier scores. Once you put down is what you put down. It'll all wash out over the course of a lot of research participants and whatnot. And this is a useful data point, and we'll collect those qualitative, comment on it in relation to the surveys, all of that. There's ways to handle all of that from a accurate research standpoint. And so that's the thing, is that when the difference between being in persistent non-symbolic experience, fundamental well-being, as we've taken to calling it more publicly, it's really a night and day type of thing. I used to liken it when I would give talks about it to the Roger Bannister. Roger Bannister is this famous story where he's the guy that broke the 4-minute mile, right? And he just died a few years ago. And he was knighted, you know, for breaking the 4-minute mile and all that. And ironically, he considered it like one of the least significant things that he did in his life. He went on to have a great career as like a medical researcher type and whatnot. But at the time that he did that, people were coming closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to the 4-minute mile, but nobody could break 4 minutes. And, you know, they're like the orthodoxy among physiologists, doctors, scientists was that the human body was just literally physiologically incapable. And they have all sorts of evidence for this at running faster than a 4-minute mile. And so that was it. That was where it peaked out. You know, you can get as close, you know, the best runners in the world were like, you know, a 10th or 100th or 1,000th or whatever it was above that, right? Whatever could be measured at that time, but that's it, you know, and they had peaked. Like they were the specimen of human perfection at that point, right? And then Roger comes along in one race and, you know, breaks it. And then within months, lots of people have broken it, right? And that orthodoxy just explodes. And so it's the same thing, you know, there is sort of this traditional belief from standard, more egoic society of what is happiness and what is maxed out happiness. And, you know, you have people like that person in that research discovering that while she's breaking that 4-minute mile barrier, that, you know, she's basically believed her whole life that, you know, she doesn't get any happier than her, you know, happiest person she knows. She's just couldn't be more grateful for how happy she is. My God, I hit the jackpot in happiness. And then, you know, on the other side of PNSE is like, wow, I had no idea, you know. So I think it's important to consider.
Very interesting research. Here's a question from another of our volunteers, Pablo Giralda, who wants to know what you think are the next big breakthroughs in the field of consciousness.
That's a good question. I think one of the things that you should be able to do is actually ask that question and say, you know, what if you were me, if this were 20 years ago, and I was going back to myself, 20, you know, I'm 35 again or whatever, right? And it's like, you know, and I can ask, what is it that I should be doing? Where do the breakthroughs lie? You ought to be able to get some kind of answer, some sort of directional answer on that, right? So my field is not, I'm not some, you know, super expert in parapsychology or, you know, some of these other fields in the consciousness space. My field is persistent non-symbolic experience. You know, that's it. That's the thing that I'm an expert in, right? And so if I came to myself, right, and was just at the beginning of all of this and had to advise what is it that I should do? Well, first I would try to figure out who is this person sitting in front of me, right? And what is it that they might actually be willing to do? And so, you know, because it's going to take time and dedication. You know, we often say to get a PhD, you've got to figure out what you're willing to spend 4 to 6 years of your life on. Mm-hmm. That's a long time to remain interested in something and really dedicated and devoted to it. And then likely after that for a long period of time from a career standpoint, right? And so the first thing that you really have to do is find the right match. And that's a big deal, finding the right mentor who wants to, you know, do the research that you're interested in and all of that, right? But if you come to someone like me, chances are we can tell you, you know, I'm probably not going to do or have the capacity to do all of the breakthrough research that I know is waiting to be done. And for some reason, people don't ask. You know, people often think that people who are more senior than them or who are very famous or whatever else are unapproachable. Oh, they'll never talk to me. Who am I? Whatever else, right? The reality is that almost everyone, as they get into those positions further on in their life, they know that sort of their time is coming to an end, right? And it's about continuing it's about getting continuity of progress, and they are incredibly willing in most cases to spend time with serious people and help them and pay it forward and get them launched and get, because, you know, it just is what makes sense. I couldn't have understood that. I didn't understand that when I was younger. I had the same perspective, I think, you know, that a lot of people had. But now I'm, you know, in my mid 50s or whatever. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. I'm in that more position where I'm like, okay, let's say I've got another 10 or 20 years of research in me. That's real different than somebody who's in their 20s or 30s or 40s. They've got a lot more that they can get done than I can get done, right? And all I want to do is have the stuff get done. I don't care who does it. It doesn't have to be me that does. I mean, what more do I have to prove, for crying out loud, at this point, right? It doesn't matter at all. And so, you know, I think it's great that you asked that question, because you should be asking people like me, and even, you know, the Stanley Krippners of the world, probably the most senior person in the general sort of consciousness study space. I mean, the greatest living legend, perhaps, in the consciousness study space, should be asking Stan. Stan is absolutely going to tell you. When I got into this, I went out to California. I sent Stan an email and I said, look, this is what I want to research. I'm just starting in the academy. I have no idea what to do. I don't know what the political landmines are. I don't know how to visualize my future. And he's like, come out to California. Let's have dinner. And I did. And that dinner set me on a course that has been completely instrumental to everything that I've done. He's like, don't make this is a mistake I made, don't make it. This is a mistake I made, don't make it. This is a mistake I made, don't make it. This is what I did right, do this. This is what I did right, do this. This is what I did right, do this. I just followed what he told me. And it was solid gold, right? So that's what I would say. First of all, just ask. People, they want the stuff done. They want the stuff continued. So from our area, there is so much stuff, right? So if I were getting a master's in something, you know, persistent non-symbolic experience related, for instance, right? At a master's, you're going to do two things. You're either going to go on to PhD level research, and so you're going to use your master's level research probably as like a pilot project, you know, for what you want to do at a PhD level, or you're going to go out into the world, right? You're going to put MA or whatever your master's degree's initials are after your name, and you're going to go out into the world as a higher level recognized expert. And what you do, and if you're going to go out in the world, you do something very different at the master's level than if you're going to go on to PhD, right? And so if I were doing something at the master's level and I were looking for a research project to do, one of the things that has got to start happening is there's a lot more people in PNSE than anyone knows. PNSE is a lot more common than people think it is. There's always this thing of like, oh, there's maybe 6 enlightened. I mean, literally, when I started researching this, people would be like, well, there's probably only like 3 enlightened people on the planet right now. How are you going to find them and research them, you know, or whatever, all right? And it turns out there's just people everywhere. And so this is, you know, this is going to, at some point, become very obvious to people. And so what you think to yourself, what's missing? Well, what's missing for those people is meaningful research in how to optimally live their life. We get questions all the time like, what's the best way to parent my children from within PNSE, right? And should I, I'm torn between introducing PNSE to my kids, or maybe I want them to grow up normal and to socialize normal and to not be in PNSE when they're young, right? Where is the expert in that, right? Talk about a great master's or even PhD thesis in that, right? Nobody's doing that kind of just basic sociological work to help the literally tens of millions of finders that are out there. It's got a built-in market for it, for crying out loud. You know, you're not going to starve. You're going to have a great career, and pick it. You know, what about career? What about marriage? What about, right? You have all these areas of life, and none of them have been done. None of them have been done. Those are all fantastic master's level projects at a minimum. Some of them would make fantastic PhD level projects, right? Come up to the PhD side of things, and there's tremendous advances that can still be made in direct brain stimulation type things, right? And so a lot more work can be done on things like the transcranial focused ultrasound. Sooner or later, that's going to get FDA approved. Sooner or later, that's going to be sitting in doctors' offices. And so, you know, when for just initially, right, it might go beyond doctors' offices, different areas of the world, probably it will just be available. So, you know, that's an area where, okay, great, we can shift somebody into fundamental well-being. We can generally deepen somebody in fundamental well-being. But how do we, I tell you what is inherent in that technology that hasn't been explored yet, and that would really take somebody seriously doing a project on it and just dedicating themselves to it. And that is, when you look at our work, we've more or less mapped out the different types of persistent non-symbolic experience, some of which we've taken time to publish on and share with the public, some of which it's in the hopper and we're just trying to get around to it as fast as we can. But most of, you know, for the most part, what you're going to experience, we've talked about. What has not been done technologically is, and what is, so where do we get those buckets? We get those buckets from researching people, right? And so there's this type of experience, and there's that type of experience, and there's this other type of experience, and they're very reliable types of experience, right? Such that I don't care who someone is. If they're in PNSE and they're describing my experience to them, I know exactly, to me, I know exactly where they're at, right? I'll be like, you're here, and here are your options from here, and here's what are potential things to keep in mind about living from this place versus this other place. I mean, I have an infinite amount of information for them, right? But these forms of persistent non-symbolic experience are the organic ones. They're the ones that have been done without significant technological intervention to the brain. One thing that focused ultrasound is going to be able to do is to create new customized versions of persistent non-symbolic experience. So this is the first technology that can reach anywhere in the brain at millimeter level scale, very precisely, upregulate, downregulate, scramble, right there, right? And so you can imagine as this technology gets ever more sophisticated, it's going to be possible to basically custom design these types of PNSE experiences that have never, ever probably been, unless somebody had some sort of brain damage, you know, they got a virus and it ate up some part of their brain or something, and they wound up accidentally getting some hack type effect in their system, right? I'm not saying it, you know, some of that's happened for sure, but the ability to really customize this, that is some important work that is waiting to be done. I don't know anybody that's doing it. There's no reason it can't be done. And I could just go on and on and on. Like, you know, if we did an hour and a half show like this, I could just talk for the entire hour and a half show about directions I know there are breakthroughs and at all of these different levels, right?
Well,
because there's just so much to be done.
Will you come back and we'll do it again and get into more of that?
Anytime.
Because we're just about out of our scheduled time for this live stream. It's been a great joy to have you with us, Jeff. Emmy, would you like to say anything in concluding our program today?
Well, I just want to say, Jeffrey Martin, you've given all of us a lot to think about. And what I hear you saying is that there's more for us to discover, but also ways that it can assist people in their lives with research behind it. And so it sounds like you're beckoning people forward with that, which is why it's so great that New Thinking Aloud has teamed up with California Institute for Human Science as our new sponsor. And if in conclusion, I would love to hear from you, Jeffrey Martin, on how people who are interested in heeding your call and perhaps even coming to your university, how can they become a student if they feel drawn to contributing in this way?
Just go to CIHS.edu,
Okay.
you know, and raise your hand, you know, and just, yeah, you know, just raise your hand. There is just so much possibility for contribution. You know, you can pick the thing like I did that you're most interested in for yourself, and just go in that direction, and that keeps you very motivated, and then you're going to be successful as a result of that. You got the right resources and people and training and all of that, and your own excitement and all that you bring to it, and the magic all comes together, and it's going to go and impact so many people as a result of that, in addition to yourself, just like it did for me.
Yeah, and I mean, being in this area is very rewarding. And I also just want to say that I'm very grateful to you, Jeffrey Mishlove, for you for decades now, for continuing to be a big channel, a big communicator of these topics. And I know a lot of the viewers and listeners are very grateful to you, Jeffery Mishlove, for bringing this forward. So it's been my pleasure and joy to be with both of you today.
Absolutely.
Thank
Absolutely.
you, Emmy. And for those of you watching live or watching the archival video, thank you for being with us. Because as I always like to say, you are the reason that we are here.